But I am wandering from what I was intending to do, and that is make plainer than perhaps appears in the previous chapters some of the peculiar requirements of the science of piloting. First of all, there's one faculty which a pilot must incessantly cultivate until he has brought it to absolute perfection. Nothing short of perfection will do. That faculty is memory. He cannot stop with merely thinking a thing is so and so. He must know it. For this is eminently one of the exact sciences. With what scorn a pilot was looked upon in the old times if he ventured to deal in that feeble phrase, "I think," instead of the vigorous one, "I know." One cannot easily realize what a tremendous thing it is to know every trivial detail of 1,200 miles of river and know it with absolute exactness. If you will take the longest street in New York and travel up and down it, conning its features patiently until you know every house and window and door and lamp-post and big and little sign by heart, and know them so accurately that you can instantly name the one you are abreast of when you're set down at random in that street in the middle of an inky black night, you will then have a tolerable notion of the amount and the exactness of a pilot's knowledge who carries the Mississippi River in his head. And then if you will go on until you know every street crossing, the character, size, and position of the crossing stones, and the varying depth of mud in each one of those numberless places, you will have some idea what the pilot must know in order to keep a Mississippi steamer out of trouble. Next, if you will take half of the signs in that long street and change their places once a month and still manage to know their new positions accurately on dark nights, and keep up with these repeated changes without making any mistakes, you will understand what is required of a pilot's peerless memory by the fickle Mississippi. I think a pilot's memory is about the most wonderful thing in the world. To know the Old and New Testaments by heart and be able to recite them glibly, forward or backward, or begin at random anywhere in the book and recite both ways, and never trip or make a mistake, is no extravagant mass of knowledge and no marvelous facility compared to a pilot's mass knowledge of the Mississippi and his marvelous facility in the handling of it. I make this comparison deliberately, and I believe I'm not expanding the truth when I do it. Many will think my figure too strong, but pilots will not. And how easily and comfortably the pilot's memory does its work. How placidly effortless it is. How unconsciously it lays up the vast stores hour by hour, day by day, and never loses or mislays a single valuable package of them all. Take an instance. Let a leadsman cry, "Half twain, half twain, half twain, half twain, half twain," until it becomes as monotonous as the ticking of a clock. Let conversation be going on all the time and the pilot be doing his share of the talking and no longer consciously listening to the leadsman. And in the midst of this endless string of half-twains, let a single quarter-twain be interjected, without emphasis, and then the half-twain cry go on again just as before. 2 or 3 weeks later, that pilot can describe with precision the boat's position in the river when that quarter-twain was uttered, and give you such a lot of head marks and stern marks and side marks to guide you that you ought to be able to take the boat in there and put her in that same spot again yourself. The cry of quarter-twain did not really take his mind from his talk, but his trained faculties instantly photographed the bearings, noted the change of depth, and laid up the important details for future reference without requiring any assistance from him in the matter. If you were walking and talking with a friend and another friend at your side kept up a monotonous repetition of the vowel A for a couple of blocks, and then in the midst interjected an R, thus A, etc., and gave the R no emphasis, you would not be able to state 2 or 3 weeks afterward that the R had been put in, nor be able to tell what objects you were passing at the moment it was done. But you could if your memory had been patiently and laboriously trained to do that sort of thing mechanically. Give a man a tolerably fair memory to start with, and piloting will develop into a colossus of capability, but only in the matters it is daily drilled in. A time would come when the man's faculties could not help noticing landmarks and soundings, and his memory could not help holding on to them with the grip of a vice. But if you asked that same man at noon what he'd had for breakfast, it would be 10 chances to 1 he couldn't tell you. Astonishing things can be done with a human memory if you will devote it faithfully to one particular line of business. At the time the wages soared so high in the Missouri River, my chief, Mr. Bixby, went up there and learned more than 1,000 miles of that stream with an ease and rapidity that were astonishing. When he had seen each division once in the daytime, once at night, his education was so nearly complete that he took out a daylight license. A few trips later, he took out a full license and went to piloting day and night. He ranked A1, too. Mr. Bixby placed me as a steersman for a while under a pilot whose feats of memory were a constant marvel to me. However, his memory was born in him, I think, not built. For instance, somebody would mention a name. Instantly, Mr. Brown would break in. "Oh, I knew him. Sallow-faced, red-bearded fellow, with a little scar on the side of his throat like a splinter under the flesh. He was only in the Southern trade 6 months. That was 13 years ago. I made a trip with him. There was 5 feet in the upper river then. The Henry Blake grounded at the foot of Tower Island, drawing 4.5, and the George Eliot unshipped her rudder under the wreck of the Sunflower. Why, the Sunflower didn't sink until, I know when she sunk. It was 3 years before that, on the 2nd of December. Asa Hardy was the captain of her, and his brother John was first clerk, and it was his first trip in her, too. Tom Jones told me these things a week afterwards in New Orleans. He was first mate of the Sunflower. Captain Hardy stuck a nail in his foot the 6th of July of the next year and died of the lockjaw on the 15th. His brother died 2 years after, 3rd of March, erysipelas. I never saw either of the Hardys. They were Allegheny River men, but people who knew them told me all these things. And they said Captain Hardy wore yarn socks winter and summer just the same. And his first wife's name was Jane Shook, and she was from New England, and his second one died in a lunatic asylum. It was in the blood. She was from Lexington, Kentucky. Name was Horton before she married, and so on by the hour the man's tongue would go. He could not forget anything. It was simply impossible. The most trivial details remained as distinct and luminous in his head after it had laid there for years in the most memorable events. His was not simply a pilot's memory. Its grasp was universal. If he were talking about a trifling letter he'd received 7 years before, he was pretty sure to have delivered you the entire screed from memory. And then, without observing that he was departing from the true line of his talk, he was more than likely to hurl in a long-drawn, parenthetical biography of the writer of that letter. And you were lucky indeed if you did not take up that writer's relatives one by one and give you their biographies too. Such a memory as that is a great misfortune. To wit, all occurrences are of the same size. Its possessor cannot distinguish an interesting circumstance from an uninteresting one. As a talker, he is bound to clog his narrative with tiresome details and make himself an insufferable bore. Moreover, he cannot stick to his subject. He picks up every little grain of memory he discerns in his way, and so is led aside. Mr. Brown would start out with the honest intention of telling you a vastly funny anecdote about a dog. He'd be so full of laugh that he could hardly begin. Then his memory would start with the dog's breed and personal appearance, drift into a history of its owner, of his owner's family, with descriptions of weddings and burials that had occurred in it, together with recitals of congratulatory verses and obituary poetry provoked by the same. Then this memory would recollect that one of these events occurred during the celebrated hard winter of such and such a year, and a minute description of that winter would follow, along with the names of people who were frozen to death, and statistics showing the high figures which pork and hay went up to. Pork and hay would suggest corn and fodder. Corn and fodder would suggest cows and horses. Cows and horses would suggest the circus and certain celebrated bareback riders. The transition from the circus to the menagerie was easy and natural. From the elephant to equatorial Africa was but a step. Then, of course, the heathen savages would suggest religion, and at the end of 3 or 4 hours' tedious jaw, the watch would change, and Brown would go out to the pilot house muttering extracts from sermons he had heard years before about the efficacy of prayer as a means of grace. And the original first mention would be all you'd learn about that dog after all this waiting and hungering.